The moment the shelter door opened, chaos turned to silence. Every dog barked except one. Inside kennel number 7, a German shepherd sat trembling, his eyes locked on the man who had just stepped in. The moment their eyes met, the dog's body stiffened and tears began to fall. No one understood what was happening. Not yet. But that man, he knew. His hand shook as he whispered, "Buddy, is that really you?" The room fell silent. What followed next was a story that left everyone, even the toughest officers, in tears. Stay till the end, because what this dog did will stay with you forever. Before we start, make sure to hit like, share, and subscribe. And really, I'm curious, where are you watching from? Drop your country name in the comments. I love seeing how far our stories travel. The morning light crept through the dusty shelter windows, spilling across rows of metal kennels. The air carried a mix of disinfectant and loneliness, a smell that clung to every corner of the place. Barking echoed faintly from the back, but kennel number 7 remained silent. Inside sat a German shepherd named Max, his golden brown eyes dull, his once proud frame now thin and weary. Volunteers walked past him carefully, whispering in low tones. "He hasn't eaten again," one murmured. Another sighed, setting down a bowl of untouched food. "He's not aggressive, just broken." Max didn't react. He stared straight ahead, unmoving, as if waiting for someone who'd forgotten him. Outside, the world went on. Families came, laughed, and left with wagging tails and wagging hearts. But for Max, each closing door echoed like a farewell. He had learned not to hope. Every time footsteps approached, his ears twitched, only to droop again when the sound faded away. Sometimes at night, the volunteers said they could hear him whine softly, a low, haunting sound that filled the empty halls. No one knew what haunted him, but everyone felt it. His eyes told stories no words could, stories of loyalty, loss, and waiting too long. Sarah, one of the shelter workers, lingered near his kennel that morning. She knelt down, trying once more to meet his gaze. "Hey, buddy," she whispered. "Someone's going to come for you, I promise." But even as she said it, her voice faltered, because deep down she wasn't sure anymore. Max finally blinked, his gaze flickering toward the door for a fleeting moment before returning to the same blank stare. The cold metal gate between them felt heavier than ever, not because of its weight, but because of what it symbolized. The clock ticked softly. Another day began, another day of waiting. The world outside was full of life, but inside kennel number 7, time stood still. And yet in that silence something stirred, a faint sense that destiny was walking closer, one step at a time. Little did Max know, by the end of this week, the man he thought he'd lost forever would walk through that very door. Long before the cold walls of the shelter, Max had known a different life, a life filled with purpose, pride, and the unbreakable bond between a man and his dog. He wasn't always just another number in a kennel. Once he wore a badge. Once he was a hero. Officer Daniel Parker still remembered the first day he met Max. The German shepherd pup was energetic, sharp-eyed, and unyielding, the kind of dog that didn't back down from anything. During their first week of training, Daniel learned that Max wasn't just intelligent, he was fiercely loyal. When Daniel fell during an obstacle course, Max didn't cross the finish line. Instead, he ran back, nudged his partner's shoulder, and refused to move until Daniel got up. From that moment on, they were inseparable. Together, they worked in the city's K-9 unit, tracking missing children, detecting explosives, and chasing down criminals through alleys and warehouses. Every mission tested their bond, and every victory strengthened it. Daniel often said Max wasn't just his partner, he was his heartbeat on 4 legs. When the world turned dangerous, Max was always there, steady and fearless. One winter night, everything changed. The police radio crackled with urgency, a drug raid gone wrong. Shots were fired, chaos erupted, and smoke filled the air. Daniel and Max were the first ones in. Max led the way, barking commands only Daniel could understand. Then came the explosion, sudden, deafening, and blinding. Daniel remembered the sound of shattering glass and Max's desperate bark before everything went dark. When he woke up in a hospital days later, his leg was bandaged, his ribs fractured, and his soul empty. The report said Max was found injured nearby, but his condition was unstable. By the time Daniel asked to see him, Max had already been transferred to a recovery facility, and then to a shelter. Bureaucracy and confusion buried their reunion under piles of paperwork. Daniel was discharged months later, limping but alive, only to discover that Max's record listed him as retired due to trauma. He searched, called, and pleaded, but every lead ended with the same cold words: no record found. For Max, the days that followed were filled with confusion. He woke up in a strange kennel, surrounded by unfamiliar faces and smells. Each bark, each whistle, none of them were Daniel's. He stopped responding. He stopped eating. Every night he'd rest his head on the cold floor, waiting for the footsteps he knew by heart. And though no one could see it, a piece of his heart stayed locked in that moment. The moment the explosion took away his partner, his purpose, and his world. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. For most dogs at the shelter, time meant healing. New beginnings, new families, wagging tails. But for Max, time stood still. Every sunrise brought the same routine: a bowl of food left untouched, a soft voice calling his name, and the hollow silence that followed. He would sit by the gate staring at the entrance, his ears twitching at every distant sound, hoping to hear a familiar voice that never came. The volunteers had grown used to his quiet nature. "He's not mean," they'd tell visitors. "Just sad." While other dogs barked and played, Max only watched. When someone passed by his kennel, he didn't move, didn't beg for attention. His eyes, however, said everything. A story of waiting, of loyalty unbroken by time. Sarah, the shelter's youngest volunteer, had taken a special liking to him. Every morning she'd kneel beside his cage, gently sliding her fingers through the metal bars. "Hey, soldier," she'd whisper. "You've got to eat something today, okay?" Sometimes he'd blink slowly as if acknowledging her. Other times he just lowered his head. She tried everything: new toys, warm meals, even soft music. Nothing worked. The only time Max showed any spark was when a certain sound played in the background, a whistle from an old police documentary that aired in the break room. His ears would perk up instantly, and for a few seconds his eyes lit up with recognition before the moment faded away. Sarah noticed it. One evening, as the rain pattered softly against the shelter windows, she tested a theory. Standing a few feet away from Max's kennel, she gently whistled the same tune from the documentary. Max lifted his head. His eyes widened, and for the first time he let out a quiet, broken whine, a sound full of longing. Her heart clenched. She didn't know who he was waiting for, but she knew this. Someone, somewhere, had left a hole in his heart that no one else could fill. Later that night, she wrote in the shelter's logbook, "German Shepherd, name Max. Responds emotionally to specific whistle pattern. Shows signs of deep attachment trauma. Still waiting." As she closed the book, Max lay down again, eyes fixed on the door. Outside, thunder rolled across the sky. Inside, a loyal heart kept waiting, unaware that fate was about to bring the past walking right through that same door. It was a gray afternoon, the kind that made everything feel slower, the sky heavy with clouds, rain tapping softly against the shelter roof. Sarah was finishing her shift when the doorbell chimed. She turned and saw a man standing at the entrance, rain dripping from his jacket. He wasn't like the usual visitors. His posture was tense, his expression distant, as if he were somewhere else entirely. "Hi there," Sarah greeted gently, brushing her hands on her apron. "Looking to adopt?" The man hesitated before nodding slightly. "I just wanted to see the dogs," he said, his voice low and rough like someone who hadn't spoken much in a while. His name was Daniel Parker. He had the look of someone who carried too many memories, eyes that had seen too much, hands that trembled when still for too long. Sarah led him down the corridor. The usual sounds of barking and wagging tails filled the air, but Daniel barely reacted. His gaze moved slowly from kennel to kennel, pausing briefly at each one before moving on. Then, halfway down the hall, he stopped. Max sat quietly in kennel number 7, his usual spot near the far corner. The fluorescent lights above flickered slightly as Daniel's eyes met his. Something shifted in the air. The noise of the shelter faded, replaced by a deep silence that neither could explain. Max's ears twitched. His body stiffened, head tilting slightly as if he were trying to understand what his senses were telling him. The man's scent, his stance, something familiar buried deep within memory, flickered like a dying flame struggling to reignite. Daniel didn't move at first. His throat tightened as he whispered under his breath, "It can't be." He took a cautious step closer, then another. Max stood, tail low but eyes locked on him, his gaze intense, uncertain, searching. Sarah noticed the change immediately. "That's strange," she said softly. He never reacts like this, but Daniel didn't hear her. His entire world had narrowed to the dog in front of him, the same eyes he thought he'd never see again. His heart pounded against his chest. Memories flooded back. Sirens, smoke, a desperate bark echoing through chaos. Max whimpered once, a soft, broken sound that echoed off the walls. Sarah froze. Daniel's breath hitched. For a heartbeat, neither man nor dog moved. Then Daniel whispered, almost afraid to believe it. "Max?" The moment Daniel spoke the name, the shelter seemed to stop breathing. The air grew heavy, every sound fading into silence. Max's ears twitched, his head tilted, and for a long second he simply stared, eyes wide, pupils trembling with something between disbelief and recognition. Then came a low, broken whine, the kind that came from deep inside, from memory and pain intertwined. Daniel stepped closer, his hands shaking. "It's me, buddy," he whispered, voice cracking under the weight of emotion. "It's Daniel." His words seemed to hang in the air like a forgotten promise finally remembered. Max took one cautious step forward, then another. His tail trembled but didn't wag, and not yet. His body shook, unsure whether to believe what his senses were screaming. Then Daniel knelt, lowering himself to the dog's level, pressing his hand gently against the metal bars. "I'm here, Max. I'm right here." The instant Max caught his scent, that familiar mix of leather, rain, and faint traces of gun oil, something in him broke loose. A whimper escaped, followed by a muffled bark. His paws scratched against the floor, claws scraping the cold cement as if he were trying to reach through the barrier that separated them. Sarah stood frozen behind them, her eyes wide. "He's never done that," she whispered. "Not once." The other volunteers peeked around the corner, drawn by the sound. Daniel blinked rapidly, tears blurring his vision. "You waited for me, didn't you?" he said softly. Max barked again, louder this time, tail thumping weakly against the gate. He pressed his snout through the small gap between the bars, desperate to touch the man in front of him. Daniel reached forward, his fingers brushing against Max's fur. Rough, cold, but real. It was all the confirmation either of them needed. Max whimpered louder, body trembling as he pressed his face against the man's hand, licking the fingers he once followed into battle. The sight melted everyone around them. Sarah covered her mouth, tears welling up. "Oh my God," she whispered. "He knows you." Daniel swallowed hard, his voice breaking as he whispered, "I thought you were gone." Max let out a long, trembling howl, not of pain, but of recognition. It echoed through the corridor, sending chills down every spine. For the first time in years, the spark returned to his eyes, that same fire Daniel had seen the day they first trained together. Sarah stepped closer, wiping her eyes. "Who are you?" she asked softly. Daniel didn't look away from Max as he answered, his voice shaking. "I'm his partner." And in that single sentence, the years of silence, loss, and heartbreak between them disappeared, replaced by something far stronger, the unspoken truth that love and loyalty never die. They just wait to be found again. The air was thick with emotion, the kind that makes every second feel heavy. Daniel knelt beside Max's kennel, tears still glistening in his eyes. The volunteers watched in silence, unsure whether to intervene or simply witness what felt like a miracle unfolding. Sarah took a hesitant step forward. He knows you," she whispered, her voice trembling. Daniel nodded slowly but said nothing. He was afraid to move, afraid to break whatever fragile thread had reconnected them after all these years. Then, as if drawn by instinct, Daniel reached for his old leather whistle. The same one that had hung around his neck during every patrol, every mission, every memory they'd ever shared. It had been with him through gunfire, rain, and loss, and now through reunion. He hesitated only for a moment before lifting it to his lips. The sound that followed was soft but clear, 3 short notes and 1 long, the exact call Max had been trained to respond to. It echoed faintly down the corridor, bouncing off cold metal walls. Max froze. His body stiffened as his ears snapped forward. The world seemed to vanish for him, the shelter, the walls, the people, and all gone. In their place, he heard that sound from years ago. The one that meant home. Then it happened. Max barked, once sharp and desperate. His tail wagged violently, hitting the bars behind him. He jumped, pawing at the gate, whining and crying in bursts of joy and disbelief. The other dogs in the shelter began barking too, sensing the surge of energy that filled the room. Daniel's hands shook as he laughed through his tears. "That's it, buddy. You remember," he choked out. Max pressed his snout between the bars, licking Daniel's fingers, crying harder with every second. Sarah covered her mouth, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I've never seen anything like this," she whispered. Daniel smiled weakly, his voice breaking as he whispered, "Neither have I." In that small, dim hallway, time folded in on itself, years of loss erased in a single familiar sound. The whistle had always been their signal of trust, of return, of home. And now, it had brought two lost souls back together again. The world outside the kennel ceased to exist. All that remained was a man and his dog, two souls bound by loyalty, torn apart by fate, and finally reunited by destiny. Daniel's hand trembled as he gripped the latch, his breath uneven. "It's really you, Max," he whispered, voice breaking with emotion. "I found you, boy." Sarah hesitated beside him. "Sir, you can't—" But before she could finish, Daniel gently turned the handle and swung open the gate. The metallic click echoed like a heartbeat through the corridor. For a single moment, Max didn't move. His eyes darted between the open door and Daniel, as if afraid it was just another dream, one that would vanish if he dared to believe it. Then with a trembling step, he crossed the threshold. The instant their eyes met, the years of separation shattered. Max lunged forward, burying his head into Daniel's chest, his cries raw and unrestrained. Daniel fell to his knees, wrapping his arms tightly around the dog who had once been his partner, his protector, his best friend. "Hey, easy, buddy," Daniel murmured, though his own tears betrayed the calm in his voice. Max licked his face frantically, whining and barking all at once, unable to contain the storm of emotion surging through him. The shelter staff stood motionless. Some smiled through tears. Others simply watched, hands clasped over their hearts. Even the most hardened volunteer couldn't help but wipe their eyes. The reunion wasn't just beautiful. It was sacred. Daniel pressed his forehead against Max's, whispering, "I thought I lost you forever." His voice cracked as he continued, "I tried to find you." "Every single day," Max answered with a low, trembling sound, tail thumping against the floor as if to say, "I waited." Sarah knelt nearby, barely holding back her tears. "He never gave up on you," she said softly. "Not for one day." Daniel looked up at her, his eyes glistening. "Neither did I." For several minutes, neither moved. The only sounds were the soft whines of reunion, the gentle brush of fur against fabric, the quiet sobs of those watching. When Daniel finally spoke again, his words were simple but heavy with gratitude. "You're home now, Max." The phrase carried a finality, a promise, one that erased every lonely night both had endured. Max responded by resting his paw on Daniel's chest, gazing up at him with those deep amber eyes that once led him through smoke and danger. The unspoken connection between them said more than words ever could. Sarah took a quiet step back, whispering to another volunteer, "I think he's finally found what he was waiting for." The man nodded, wiping his eyes. "Yeah," he murmured. They both did. As the rain continued to fall outside, the shelter, once filled with echoes of forgotten lives, now held a moment that would never be forgotten. Daniel stood slowly, his arm around Max, both of them trembling but complete. The past had hurt them. The years had separated them, but in this instant, the world made sense again. And for the first time in a long time, Max's eyes weren't filled with sadness. They were filled with something far more powerful. Hope. The rain outside the shelter faded into a low hum, and as Daniel sat there, one hand resting on Max's back, the memories he had tried so hard to bury began to resurface, vivid, sharp, and painful. It had been a winter night, bitterly cold and unforgiving. The city lights flickered through heavy fog as Daniel and Max prepared for their final mission together. They were part of a SWAT-assisted operation, a warehouse raid targeting a major drug ring. The air crackled with tension. Officers whispered into radios, weapons drawn, hearts steady. Daniel crouched beside Max, patting his head gently. "Stay close, partner," he said, and Max responded with a low bark, his signal of readiness. When they breached the building, chaos exploded. Shouts, gunfire, and smoke filled the air. Max darted ahead, sniffing through the haze, guiding Daniel toward a hidden room where the suspects were barricaded. His instincts were flawless until the flashbang went off. The explosion was deafening. The floor trembled, metal groaned, and the ceiling gave way. Daniel shouted, "Max!" as debris rained down around them. He could hear the dog barking, frantic, searching for him. Then another blast. The shockwave threw Daniel backwards, slamming him into a wall. Everything went black. When he woke, it was morning. The world was silent except for the faint beep of hospital machines. His vision was blurry, his leg bandaged, ribs cracked. He tried to sit up, but pain shot through him. The nurse rushed over. "Easy, Officer Parker. You've been out for 3 days. Where's my dog?" he croaked. The nurse hesitated, then looked away. The canine was recovered, but he's injured. They transferred him to another facility. Daniel tried to get out of bed, but his body refused to move. Weeks later, when he finally walked again, he learned that Max had been retired, labeled unfit for duty due to trauma. The system had lost track of him after that. Daniel filed reports, made calls, searched databases, but Max's file always ended the same way: status unknown. Each unanswered call felt like another door closing. Eventually, the department stopped responding. For Max, those same nights were filled with confusion. He woke surrounded by strangers, bandages on his side, a cone around his neck. He barked for Daniel and his handler, his friend, but no one came. Each day, the scent faded, replaced by antiseptic and loneliness. The mission that had bonded them through fire had also torn them apart. Now, years later, sitting on the cold shelter floor, Daniel finally whispered the words he never got to say that night. "I'm sorry, Max. I should have found you sooner." Max looked up, pressing his head into Daniel's chest, as if forgiving him for everything. The hours that followed were quiet, but the air around Daniel and Max felt different, warmer, calmer, alive again. After years of emptiness, both man and dog sat together in a small room behind the shelter, the world outside fading into soft evening light. Daniel ran his fingers through Max's fur, feeling every scar, every rough patch, every sign of the years they had lost. "You've been through so much, haven't you, buddy?" Daniel whispered. Max leaned into his touch, eyes half closed, his breathing steady and calm for the first time in a long time. Sarah brought in a bowl of food and placed it nearby. "He hasn't eaten properly in months," she said softly. "But maybe he will now." Daniel smiled faintly. "He will." He tapped the edge of the bowl gently, the same way he used to after missions. Max's ears perked up at the familiar sound. Slowly, hesitantly, he walked over and began to eat. Small bites at first, then steady ones. The sight made Sarah's heart swell. "He remembers," she said quietly. Daniel nodded. "He remembers everything." His eyes glistened as he continued. "And so do I." As the room filled with silence once more, Daniel began telling Sarah the story of the explosion, the search, the empty reports, and the years of believing Max was gone. "He saved my life that night," Daniel said, voice breaking. "If it weren't for him, I'd never have made it out. I thought I'd lost him for good." Sarah wiped her eyes. "He never gave up, you know. He always waited. Every day he'd stare at that door like he knew someone was coming back for him." Daniel swallowed hard, looking at Max, now curled up beside his feet. "He's stronger than I ever was," he murmured. For the first time in years, Max's body relaxed completely. His eyes fluttered shut as his head rested on Daniel's boot, a quiet sigh leaving his chest. That single gesture spoke louder than words. Forgiveness, love, and peace all wrapped in one. Sarah stepped back from the doorway, watching them in silence. The broken soldier and his forgotten dog, healing each other piece by piece. Outside, the sky turned orange with the setting sun. Inside, after years of waiting and pain, two hearts finally began to mend, together. The next morning, Daniel arrived at the shelter early. The sun had barely risen, its soft golden light filtering through the windows, casting long shadows across the hallway. Max was already awake, tail wagging faintly as soon as Daniel appeared. The transformation in his spirit was undeniable. The spark was back. Sarah smiled when she saw them. "He's a completely different dog now," she said warmly. "You should have seen him before yesterday." Daniel chuckled softly. "He just needed his partner." But when he approached the front desk, reality hit. The shelter manager, a stern woman named Mrs. Caldwell, looked up from her paperwork. "Officer Parker, I'm afraid we can't just hand him over," she said firmly. "There's a procedure for every adoption, especially one involving a retired service dog." Daniel's smile faded. "I understand the rules, ma'am, but Max isn't just any dog. He's my partner. We served together for years." Mrs. Caldwell adjusted her glasses. "I don't doubt that. But we have to follow the protocol. You'll need to submit an adoption request, proof of service, and complete the temperament test. Only then can we finalize it." Her tone was calm but firm, the kind that left no room for exceptions. Daniel exhaled, his jaw tightening. "After everything he's been through, you're telling me I have to apply to take him home?" Sarah stepped in quickly. "Mrs. Caldwell, maybe we could make an exception," but the manager shook her head. "If we bend the rules once, we'll be asked to do it again. It's for the dog's safety, too." Daniel looked through the glass window where Max sat watching him patiently, his eyes full of trust. "You've got your rules," he said quietly. "And I've got my promise. I'm not leaving here without him." The determination in his voice made Sarah's heart tighten. She placed a hand on his arm. "We'll make it work," she said gently. "You bring the papers and I'll help you push them through." Mrs. Caldwell hesitated, finally softening. "If everything checks out, he's yours." Daniel nodded, glancing back at Max. "Then I better get started." And as he turned to leave, Max pressed his paw against the glass as if saying, "I'll wait." 2 days later, the shelter yard was unusually quiet. A few volunteers gathered near the fence, whispering among themselves. Today was the day of Max's final behavioral test, the last step standing between him and his home. Daniel stood beside Sarah, hands in his pockets, trying to stay calm. But his heart was pounding harder than it ever had on any police raid. Across the yard, Max sat alert, his ears perked, eyes fixed on Daniel. The trainer, a tall man with a clipboard, cleared his throat. "We'll be testing obedience, response, and temperament under mild stress," he explained. "If he passes, he's free to go." Daniel nodded, though his chest felt tight. He knelt down, giving Max one reassuring pat. "You've got this, buddy," he whispered. Just like old times, the test began. Simple commands at first, and sit, stay, come. Max obeyed instantly, his movements sharp and precise, the kind of discipline that never fades. The trainer scribbled notes, nodding approvingly. "Good start," he murmured. Then came the distraction phase. A volunteer slammed a gate nearby, creating a loud metallic clang. Max's ears flicked toward the sound, but he didn't flinch. Instead, he shifted his stance slightly, stepping closer to Daniel. Protective, steady, unafraid. The trainer's brows rose. Impressive control. Next was the trigger test. A sudden loud noise burst from a speaker. A recording of distant gunfire. The air tensed. Max barked once, low and firm, then immediately positioned himself in front of Daniel, guarding him instinctively. Daniel's throat tightened as he whispered, "Still my hero." When the noise stopped, Max looked up at him for a command. Daniel smiled, voice steady. "At ease." The German Shepherd relaxed, sitting down beside him, calm and confident. Sarah exhaled in relief. "He's perfect," she whispered. The trainer nodded, removing his sunglasses. "He's not just well-trained," he said quietly. "He's loyal, the kind you can't teach. That dog would walk through fire for you." Daniel smiled faintly. "He already has." The trainer signed the papers, handing them to Mrs. Caldwell, who had been watching from the sidelines. She studied the results, then finally looked up at Daniel. "Congratulations, Officer Parker," she said with a small smile. "He's cleared for release." Daniel looked down at Max, emotion flooding his chest. "You hear that, partner? You're going home." Max barked once, proud, confident, and free. The sun hung low in the afternoon sky, its light spilling across the shelter courtyard like liquid gold. A quiet crowd of volunteers gathered near the entrance, their faces glowing with smiles and tearful pride. For months they had watched Max waste away behind cold metal bars, and now they were about to see him walk free. Mrs. Caldwell approached Daniel, holding a folder of papers close to her chest. "Everything's in order," she said, her voice softer than usual. "You've been officially approved for adoption." Daniel nodded, signing the final line with a trembling hand. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for keeping him safe all this time." The manager smiled faintly. He wasn't waiting for just anyone, Officer Parker. He was waiting for you. Daniel crouched beside Max, unclipping the leash that tethered him to the shelter. You ready to go home, partner? He whispered. Max tilted his head, ears perked, tail slowly wagging as if he understood every word. Sarah, standing nearby, wiped a tear from her cheek. Go on, hero, she whispered. You've earned your freedom. The gate creaked open and sunlight poured across the threshold. For a moment, Max hesitated, staring at the world beyond as though it were something he'd forgotten how to trust. Then Daniel called softly, Come on, boy. That was all it took. Max stepped forward, one paw after another, crossing the line between captivity and freedom. The crowd erupted into quiet applause. His fur shimmered in the sunlight, and for the first time in years his tail wagged high and proud. Daniel looked down at him, tears glinting in his eyes. No more cages, he said softly. No more waiting. Sarah smiled, her voice trembling. Take care of him, Daniel. Daniel nodded. He's family. As they walked away together, man and dog side by side, Max looked back one last time at the shelter, the place that had held his pain, but also kept his hope alive. Then he turned his gaze forward, the wind brushing against his fur, freedom filling his lungs, and for the first time in a long time, both hearts finally beat in rhythm again, homeward bound. Weeks passed, and the rhythm of life began to settle into something beautiful again. Daniel's small countryside home, once quiet and empty, was now alive with sound. The gentle clicking of paws across wooden floors, the rustle of fur on the couch, and the occasional joyful bark that echoed through the halls. Every morning, Daniel brewed his coffee while Max sat by the window, watching the sunrise. It had become their ritual, a quiet moment that reminded them both how far they'd come. When Daniel opened the door to the porch, Max would step outside, lift his nose to the breeze, and take in the world that was once lost to him. The open, fields, the rustling trees, the freedom, it was all his again. In the afternoons they trained together, not for duty but for fun. Daniel tossed an old tennis ball across the yard, laughing as Max sprinted after it with the same enthusiasm he once had as a police K-9. Sometimes Daniel would blow his whistle, 3 short notes and 1 long, and Max would come running, tail wagging, eyes bright. Every time Daniel's heart swelled a little more. At night they sat by the fireplace. Max would curl up at Daniel's feet, resting his head on his boots, the way he used to after long shifts years ago. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was peaceful, full of unspoken gratitude. One evening, Sarah visited with a small gift, a leather collar engraved with Max's name and a single word underneath, Hero. She smiled softly as she fastened it around his neck. This is where you belong, she said. Daniel nodded, his gaze tender. Yeah, he replied, rubbing Max's head. He's finally home. The house, once haunted by loss, was now filled with warmth and laughter. And though the world outside moved on, inside that small home lived a story of loyalty, survival, and love that never broke. Not even in the darkest of times. As the fire crackled and the stars shimmered outside, Max sighed contently in his sleep. His waiting was finally over. He was home. Forever. A few months later, a news van pulled up in front of Daniel's house. The story of the crying shelter, dog who recognized his long-lost handler, had spread far beyond the shelter walls. Reporters wanted to see the bond everyone had been talking about, the reunion that had touched millions of hearts online. Daniel stood on the porch, a little uncomfortable in front of the cameras. Max sat proudly beside him, wearing his new collar, chest out and eyes bright. The cameraman crouched, capturing every detail, the scar near Max's ear, the steady way he watched his human, the way his tail thumped gently against the floor whenever Daniel spoke. A young reporter stepped forward with a smile. Officer? Parker, she began. People all over the world are calling Max a hero. Can you tell us what this reunion means to you? Daniel looked down at Max, then back at the reporter. His eyes softened. It's hard to put into words, he said. When I thought I'd lost him, it felt like losing a part of myself. We went through so much together, danger, fear, trust, and then nothing. Years of silence. He paused, his voice thick with emotion. And yet somehow he never gave up on me. The reporter leaned forward. How did it feel when he recognized you? Daniel smiled faintly, eyes glistening. It was like the world stopped. One look, and it was him. The same loyalty, the same love. You don't get that twice in life. Max barked softly, as if agreeing. The reporter laughed gently. He really does seem to understand every word. Daniel chuckled, patting Max's head. He always did. That's what makes him special. He's not just a dog, he's my partner. The camera zoomed in as Daniel continued quietly. He saved my life more times than I can count. And in a way, he saved it again when he found me. The reporter lowered her microphone, smiling warmly. That's beautiful. As the interview ended, Max lay beside Daniel, eyes calm, tail wagging slowly. The cameras might have captured a story, but what they witnessed was something far greater, the kind of bond that time, distance, and even fate could never break. A few weeks after the news story aired, Daniel returned to the same shelter where it had all begun. The building looked different now, brighter somehow, filled with life and hope. As he stepped inside, Max walked proudly beside him, wearing his engraved hero collar. The volunteers lit up at the sight of them. Look who's back, Sarah called out, smiling warmly. Max trotted over to her, tail wagging, pressing his head gently against her arm. She laughed through tears. You look happy, big guy. Daniel handed her a small envelope. Inside was a donation check and a handwritten note that read, "For the ones still waiting." Sarah's eyes softened. You didn't have to. I wanted to, Daniel said, his tone gentle. This place gave me my family back. It's time I help another find theirs. Just then, a faint whine echoed from the corner of the room. A young canine shepherd, thin and nervous, peered out from his kennel. His eyes were frightened, the same look Max once had. Daniel crouched down, extending his hand slowly. Hey there, buddy, he murmured. You remind me of someone I used to know. The dog sniffed his fingers, tail twitching uncertainly. Max stepped forward, nudging Daniel's arm, then gently nudged the cage door, as if urging him to open it. Sarah smiled knowingly. Thinking of making it too? Daniel chuckled softly. Maybe it's time Max becomes the teacher now. She nodded. Second chances deserve company. Moments later, Daniel signed the papers. The young dog stepped hesitantly out of the kennel, sniffing the air, then pressed close to Max, instantly calmer in his presence. As Daniel led them both toward the door, sunlight spilled across the floor. He turned back once more and said quietly, No hero should ever be forgotten. Outside, the breeze carried the faint scent of freedom, the same one Max had once rediscovered. Together, the three walked down the path side by side, and as the shelter doors closed behind them, the story came full circle, a tale of loss, love, and the kind of loyalty that never fades. It simply waits to be found again.